I never fail to be touched, to be energized, to be moved by the stories of our faith. There are ways in which they touch me, they engage me, and they always do this. None any more than those leading up to Holy Week and including that week. There's something about that time period that engages me more deeply. It just gets me. And I love it. I wrestle with them. I try to do various things with them. I think that what happens for me, now I know that what happens for me, is that I began somehow to see myself as one of the disciples. So I began to think about how this will affect me, what it would be like to be in this place doing that. And of course, I'm really kind of off away from that, but there's still this involvement with it. It's one thing to take those stories leading to Jerusalem. It's another level to take those stories in Jerusalem, that movement to Golgotha. And to get there, and as John recounts, to stand afar off and look at Jesus on the cross. But I'm also engaged by these post-resurrection stories too. They are really intense, and they engage me and involve me in different ways. As I think about being in that place and that time with Jesus, I imagine all kinds of reactions. I imagine confusion. I imagine disillusionment. I imagine intense fear. Maybe some anger, but I know that I, in those situations, would be very, very afraid, especially as I stand afar off and look at the cross. How about you? Do those stories in any way engage you too? I'm aware that as we begin to look at what happens with the disciples during those time periods, they were people who had certain expectations. They're like us. Anytime we go into a situation or into a relationship or whatever it is we're going into, we go in with expectations. We may not be aware of some of them. We may not articulate them, which can be a real issue at times. But we bring expectations into just about every encounter that we have. And the disciples did that in their encounter with Jesus. Every one of them had expectations of who He would be in their lives. Probably as many expectations as there were disciples who followed Him. Some expected that He would be some great spiritual leader and help them somehow be more faithful. Others thought He would be a political leader and take an office somehow because that's how the change could come about. And some had the expectation that He would be a revolutionary and He would challenge the powers that be. We all bring expectations in our relationships with Jesus. Articulated, perhaps. Maybe not even aware of what they are. But in each case, they bring the fruit of disappointment. Now, I would imagine in those days after His resurrection, those expectations continued. Sure, they saw Jesus twice before today's gospel, but on neither occasion did they know who He was. He just didn't look like His old self. So here it is, they've gone through all of these expectations of what would happen. And, well, maybe He rose again, but we don't know what that means. So what happens? They're disillusioned, they're disappointed. And when I'm disillusioned and disappointed, I look for something to do. that will anchor me, something that's important to me, something that's natural to me. So what do the fishermen do? They go fishing. They go fishing. And of course they go at night because the fish don't bite during the day. Now, to add insult to injury, these disciples whose expectations had left them disappointed climb in a boat, go out, and what happens? The fishermen don't catch any fish. I've been there. I would love to tell you that when I've gone fishing, I've always caught my limit. I can tell you that. It's a lie. But I can tell you that. But to have someone walk up to me and go, "Caught anything today?" It almost brings a sense of shame. And I suspect that's about what happened with those disciples in that boat. Some stranger on the bank, someone they didn't know, looked out at them and said, "Caught any?" No. Now, about this time, I figure that both as disciples and fishermen, they're beginning to get to wonder about their own worth. We didn't do very well as disciples, and we're not doing well as fishermen. Maybe something is happening in our lives. So this stranger on the bank, who probably wasn't even a fisherman, says, "Well, throw your nets on the other side, on the right side, and pull them out, and pull it out." And they did, and they caught 153 fish. I don't know the significance of the number other than it's a big number. But they caught all these fish. And then it happens. John elbows Peter. "That's Jesus. That's Jesus." And so Peter kind of acts like he always acts. He's naked. We have debates about that term. That's why I did that. He's naked, so he puts on clothes and jumps in the lake. Seems a bit backwards to me. But anything to get to Jesus. And he gets there, wondering his own worth in the eyes of Jesus, knowing that he's disappointed himself by not living up to his own expectations because he denied Jesus 3 times before he died. And he sees him, and Jesus has a fire going, and he's already got fish on there. And he asks them to bring his fish to him. And those disciples who were disheartened and disillusioned and disappointed came to eat with Jesus, that thing he always had them do. And when they saw those fish, they remembered fish from other times. And they knew, without a doubt, that it was him. You and I bring expectations into our lives, our daily lives, our relationships, our existence. And we always seem to disappoint ourselves. We may disappoint each other. We do that. But the ones that hit hardest are the ones where we disappoint ourselves, where we have these expectations that somehow we can live out our lives in certain ways, and then we can't do it. "Oh, I'll do that." Sure, I'll do that. I had some of those disappointments last week. Part of what I did while I was not here last week was that I did some work on some things at home that I haven't had time to do lately. Now, these are things that I've done time and time again. And when I've done them before, years ago, they kind of went like, so, that's how it's going to happen again. I expect when I do this task, it'll be... So, it goes. And then I have to go back to Lowe's. I have to go back to Lowe's because I've now really, really messed up. And I would get frustrated. I would get frustrated not because the job was difficult, but because I could not live up to my expectations. I couldn't do it. So Jesus is there, and these disciples are coming with their disappointments, but somehow he seems to move beyond that, and he looks at Simon Peter, this guy who has denied him, and he looks at him and he says, "Do you love me?" I'm sure Peter flashed back to that evening, that night. And he said, "Yes, Lord, I love you." And so what does Jesus say? He says, "Feed my lambs." And he looks at Peter again and he says, "Peter, do you love me?" And I suspect Peter's getting a little irked by now. He was not one that took things well. And he said, "Yes, Lord, I love you." He said, "Well, tend my sheep." The third time, he looks at him and he says, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter is irked by this time, and he says, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you. Feed my sheep." You see, I think Peter was confused. I think he thought Jesus really wanted to know if he loved him. I don't think Jesus wanted to know if he loved him. I think Jesus knew he loved him. I think what Jesus was doing was he was taking this fellow, the one who had let him down, the one who felt badly about having let him down and not meeting his own expectations, and he was commissioning him to do ministry in his name. It's easy for us to get caught up in those times in our lives when we don't meet ours or other people's expectations. It's easy for us to begin to wonder about our worth as followers of Jesus. It's easy for us to think about what we can't do and never consider what we can do. But it seems to me that in this example of Jesus appearing to these disciples at the lake that day, there is good news for us. And the good news is this: no matter who else we have disappointed, no matter whose expectations we have failed to meet in our lives, including our own, Jesus claims us. Jesus takes us and uses us as His hands and feet and voice in this world. And nothing can take that away from us. Not even our sense of disappointment and disillusionment in life. So there we have it. There we have it. We will continue to disappoint ourselves and each other. But never think that you disappoint God enough that God will not love you and use you in God's kingdom. Amen.